Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and the people and places and events that make Rhode Island a great place to live, that build our communities. There are so many people working behind the scenes, and we love to interview all of those people so that we know who's actually making Rhode Island a great place to live. And today we're very happy to welcome Tina Kane, who's here with us from Rumsford, Rhode Island. She is now the new Poet Laureate, but she's been working behind the scenes and in front of the scenes for a long time for our kids in schools. And so welcome, Tina.
Thank you.
We're so glad to have you here. And it's so great to see all the work that the kids are doing under your leadership. You were working on a project called Writers in Schools, Rhode Island, and this was an idea that you had a while ago, I guess, as a teacher.
Historically, I was a French and English teacher for many years in New York City, and at a certain point in my career, after about 6 years of working at a Quaker school in downtown New York, I wanted more time to write. And I didn't have any children at that time. Now I have 3, but I wanted more time to write, so I began working for an organization called Teachers and Writers Collaborative. And that was founded by poets in the 1960s, and they send poets and other writers of other genres into public school classrooms to teach imaginative writing. And they have a press. It's a really incredible enterprise. So I worked for them for a few years until I had my first child, and then we moved to Rhode Island, and I really missed that work because it gave me a lot of flexibility as a writer to carve my own schedule, but it was also sending me into schools that had the most need. And I found that the work was incredibly rewarding. So when I was here and I really wanted to start getting back into the practice of teaching and writing, I looked around and there wasn't anything like it. So I kind of bluffed my way into making up a program based on that program. So mine is a very tiny version of that very large and kind of legendary program. So,
but possibly now it will become statewide. I mean, without too much expansion.
Yeah, I
being
mean,
impossible for you.
You know, I've had people in the past, over the years, I've had the program for about 9 years. I've had people in the past say, this should be statewide. And I believe in that concept. I actually believe on a national level, there should be a writer in residence at every public school. And that would be something that I really advocate for. And maybe an artist in residence of every genre in every public school. But I've also mindful that I am the program, and I hire other poets and writers to teach alongside me in other classrooms where I can't be. But I am the founder and the director, and I do all the stuff, so I'm just me. And I'm much more conscious of quality versus quantity. So I'd rather be in a couple of schools really deeply with the students than kind of spreading everything too thin and not getting to the best work.
And the students that you have are students basically in Rumsford, or where are the schools?
No. I live in Rumford, but occasionally I visit my children's school, Myron J. Francis. I visit and I do a volunteer workshop to my children's classroom. But we've been in schools all over Providence, Martin Luther King, Varden Gregorian, Nathan Bishop. I spent 4 years at Central Falls High School as a visiting writer to history classes. I've been at Noel Leadership Academy in the Providence and Central Falls location. And last year, we did every classroom in the new middle school at LaSalle Academy for the entire year. And so that was really great. But so I've been in many, many schools all around.
Schools invite you to come?
They invite me. Usually I have a relationship where I reach out to the principal, or I know someone whose child goes to the school who knows about my program and appeals to their administration to bring it in. I had a really great stint with the Central Falls school system because they had a grant writer on staff at the school department who would write the grant to then bring me in, and that was really wonderful.
People say they don't understand poetry, but if you start early, I'm sure kids will understand poetry when they become adults.
Yeah, you know, historically, people in American education started learning poetry early, I mean, I started memorizing it. I learned poetry in elementary school and in middle school, and then in high school, scant poetry in high school. But I think it's the way that poetry is taught, and it's not any fault of the teachers, you know, or the administration. It's just kind of a different way of approaching poetry. So I tend to bring in poems because I know what the teachers are teaching and what the curriculum, the syllabus gives them to cover with the children during a poetry unit. So I always make sure to bring in work that they're never going to see. You know, they're never going to see some of these poets who are living poets living in Brooklyn, or who are contemporary poets writing about very topical themes, or even poets who are kind of outside of the canon and whose work is very experimental and strange. I always try to bring in something that really raises the bar and is kind of surprising, even shocking, but appropriate, you know.
So what they're learning is that it's their own voice. It could be their own voice.
Yeah, and what they're learning too is that poetry isn't anything that they thought it was.
It's not something dusty that you have to dust off and you know, hang up to the light. It's already in the light, is what you're saying.
And that, you know, I was just talking about this yesterday to somebody else, saying that the main thing that I want students and teachers, actually, because sometimes my visits or another writer's visits end up being part professional development as well, because the teacher gets some ideas about how to approach teaching poetry or getting the students to write more creatively or imaginatively.
Why don't we look at some of these?
Okay.
These are broadsides that you've done so that students can see their own work, but also so that you can send it out to other people so that they can see what work you've done.
So these are broadsides. They're poetry and art posters. They, I've made them many years in different incarnations. These are photographs taken by students at age 220 youth, paired with poems by students who were at Central Falls High School in a history class that I worked with. So these were ESL students who were learning English still, but you know, I find that creative writing, poetry in particular, is extremely useful for getting students who are still in the midst of learning English to break through and make a lot of advances, because the opportunity for personal self-expression as opposed to formal writing in connection with demonstrating comprehension or doing more structured writing for their schoolwork can be very intimidating and very demanding, but when they're encouraged to play with words and not worry too much about the syntax or the grammar, and also to infuse their poems with their native language, you know, to bring music or other aspects to it, that they blossom. And they feel much less intimidated and much more galvanized to find the right word because it's the word that they want, as opposed to the word that they feel they should be using for the purposes of, you know.
Why don't you try reading one of these and see?
Oh, this is a great one. And so in this set of broadsides, the art was made for the poem. The students looked at the poems and drew and created work to go with it. So this one is called The First Time I Came to America. It's by Sonia Pires, and she was at Central Falls High School. And then bear in mind, she was a recent arrival. I think she probably had been in America for about a year. When I got off the plane, I felt the cold breeze on my face. The smell was different. It smelled like new shoes and new clothes. It was a fancy smell. The streets were filled with cars and trucks and motorcycles. The houses were filled with lights. It was like the sun. It was so bright that I had to cover my eyes. I felt like everybody was looking at me and saying, "She's weird." I hesitated for a moment. I thought about what I had left behind. I felt cold and country sick. As I walked forward, I wanted to go back on the plane and go home, my real home. When I saw my parents, it felt like I didn't know them. When we got in a car, I cried so hard that I couldn't breathe. I was crying, but there were no tears. My eyes were dry.
Oh, my.
And there's another one I love, and these were done, some of these were original art created for each poem, like this one. And then, you know, all of these poems are translated into Spanish by Cecilia Parado, who's the translator I use. And this way, when we distribute, we send them out, but I also give a bunch to the students with the idea that they go put them in like bodegas or laundromats or libraries or shops where, or just have them displayed, sometimes where you'll walk into like a bakery and there'll be posters for upcoming events. Well, why not a poetry poster just up on the bulletin board? Exactly. So we sort of do that, and it's kind of a public art, but you know, advocacy for poetry. And this I love.
And advocacy for kids.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, she put her soul right there on that page.
Yep. And then this one, again, Central Falls High School, again, Sonia. Yep, the first time I spoke English. And so, you know, by virtue of these two poems by the same person, you really understand how the story wants to be told. And so when the students are given opportunities to tell the story, the language just kind of pours out of them. And, you know, oftentimes I have teachers, for years I've been doing this work all over New York City and in Rhode Island, but teachers always learn something about their students. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know his father was in jail, or I didn't know his grandmother passed away 2 months ago, or these really important aspects of their children's lives that really helps them as teachers, I think, maintain a connection. So the first time I spoke English, I remember people laughed at me. Their laughter was loud, like the speakers when the music is all the way up. I remember when my teacher said, "How are you?" And I said, "Sonia." I remember how people looked at me. It was like I had a drawing on my face and they were trying to understand it. I remember when I said the word "hi." I remember my cousin Linda helping me. She knew English very well. I remember when I tried to understand my teachers. They were talking, but all I heard was blah, blah, blah. I remember when I actually heard them. It sounded clear. I remember when I said, "Good, and you?" So, you know, it's funny, I haven't looked at these for a while, and I remember.
She will be a poet.
Well, you know, what you realize is that, you know, it's just funny, there's this movie I watch called Ratatouille with my children. We've seen it 10 times, and one of the characters is a chef, and his sort of creed is anyone can cook. And, you know, not to be facile, like anybody can write poetry. Not everybody wants to be a poet or should be a poet, but anyone can write, and it's the kind of thing where you don't necessarily have to become a professional writer, and the writing may not even be fantastic from a literary perspective, but having the right tools and understanding the elements of what goes into good writing does mean that anybody can write. And by write, I mean express what they want to express with precision and purposefulness, you know. And I think that's what makes good writing too. So we've made a ton of these. Last year we actually made 10 original different double-sided bilingual broadsides at LaSalle Academy. So these are just 2 of them, but we had so many students because we were in the entire middle school that we had to make 10 so that we could have 20 students' poems, because I didn't want to relegate it to only like 3 or 4. So again, these were, so the idea was to graphically distinguish each side. And Atticus Allen, who is my broadsides designer, designed these, and he's amazing. He's also in the Little Compton Band.
They're beautiful. Do you want to read one of them?
Sure.
Are they in English? Or?
They're in English and in Spanish. This one is called Confession by May Pricolo. She's a 7th grader, an 8th grader actually, at LaSalle. And this actually came out of a project that I did called the Poe Project with them, which I collaborated on with the Athenaeum, the Providence Athenaeum. And I did 5 field trips to the Providence Athenaeum with LaSalle students, 7th and 8th graders. And we had a bookmaking workshop. We learned about Edgar Allan Poe's presence in Providence and in the Athenaeum. We looked at rare documents having to do with Poe. And then we had pizza, and then we went to DWRI Letterpress on the west side of Providence. And we had collaborated on exquisite corpse poems that I had the children make that were inspired by their writings after reading Edgar Allan Poe. And we had sent them to Dan, and he had set them up on a linotype machine, and the kids got to work the machines and crank out these beautiful printed letterpress broadsides and take them home. So this particular poem is from a cut-up that May did having to do with the raven. I had them do cut-up poems of the raven. So, confession. The confession of the crow, crawling, coursing, conflicting his conscience. The confession is cunningly kept, yet it killed him to confine his confession in a cage. Cursing his crummy conscience, the crow cried coarsely, cradling his kept confession close. Corrupt the crow is. Can closure be caught if he calls out his confession? Discouraged, the crow found he couldn't. The confession of the crow shall be kept covered. All about alliteration.
Yes.
So here's a great one. This one's a little harder to see because it's a very pale, it was meant to be a kind of more delicate rendition, but it's called I Remember. And this was a student, she was at the middle school in Central Falls. What I Remember by Pamela Torres. There was a rainbow-colored butterfly on a hot day flying in the playground near my house in San Juan. I almost caught it with my hands. On my 8th birthday in San Juan, my mother had a big party. All my family came. My mother hired a clown. He made my grandmas act funny and sit on balloons. Everyone was laughing. My first day of school in Central Falls at Veterans Memorial was really fun. My teacher sang a math song about animals, and we had to run around and sit in chairs that had the right answer. When I turned 10, I came to Calcut. The first 3 days were all about rules. I liked the rule about changing desks. I didn't like the rule about sitting in the back of the room. So
I think kids are so honest, aren't they? It just comes very naturally. And when you give them that vehicle,
the opportunity,
the vehicle.
Yeah, you give them tools and the opportunity, and yeah, and we've done. I really like going into history classrooms because I really like it's an arts integration approach. I really like for students to understand that history and the arts are not in separate boxes. Sort of like the bell rings and you go to history, and the bell rings you go to, Spanish, and the bell rings. Well, artists alive today are living in contemporary culture, which in 25 years will be history. And so the cultural moment that an artist is living in has a direct impact on their work, even if they're not writing specifically or pointedly about current events, but that the cultural tides and the political climate have an impact, and art has an impact and is a reflection of what's going on in the culture. So I really like that intersection, but I've also sent poets into science classrooms to teach poetry in an earth science setting. Because there, in the public schools, subject teachers are beholden to have the students fulfill a writing piece. And oftentimes a science teacher or a math teacher doesn't really know how to get the kids writing around their subject. And so bringing a poet in is this really great way of satisfying that requirement, giving the teacher ideas. But also, if you have a child sitting in a science classroom who loves science but really hates English, and then you have a poet come in and you have to write poems, it's counterintuitive to a kid, but then what happens is the child who feels strong in science can suddenly start experimenting with writing in a setting that she feels comfortable in, the science classroom. And the student who really loves to write but hates science, or maybe doesn't feel very strong in it, is able to do what they feel strong in a setting in which they don't usually feel as capable in. And so it breaks down a little bit of those barriers, but also shows them that these, like Leonardo da Vinci, there are intersections between all of these disciplines, and they're separate only because we've made them so.
And maybe we need to change education.
Yes, and math is a language, science is a system, language is a system. All of these things have relationships that need to be, the threads need to be pulled, and they can be woven together in a way that's meaningful.
You talk about imaginative writing when you talk about your program. And this is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Allow kids to jump in with the knowledge they have and then move forward into a poem.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I was an English teacher for many years, so I'm constantly reinforcing English and grammar concepts. Because I feel like it's very important, especially working with ESL students. You know, is saying, okay, so look at what's happening with this verb here, but you can change that, and you know, take a look at this poem has no punctuation. If it were to have punctuation, where would it be? You know, so there's always ways to, because I feel that that's very important for the teachers to feel that the skills that they need their students to acquire are being reinforced through this writing. Because the two, again, are not separate. Just because you're being creative doesn't mean that all the rules go out the window or you don't need to know them. And I was just saying the other day, you need to know the rules to break them and to make decisions, to be intentional about how you're writing and to kind of take control of the writing and, you know, make it your system.
The other thing you're doing, which you can't measure, is sociological, emotional. The child is learning about herself or himself.
Yeah.
And self-actualization happens as the kids pull together all these different threads, maybe interdisciplinary threads, but also their own personal life.
I think that's, you know, I think that's huge. And I think that when I look at the way that public education is moving, I feel a lot of sympathy for the teachers because they're asked to do so much more now. In so many ways, they're asked to be an Erstadt's parent in the classroom. And there are just too many children in one classroom for a teacher to know necessarily that a child's grandmother passed away, unless the parent sends a note in. You know, there's not enough time for the teachers to get to know the children individually and personally on a level that creates a deep connection. And so through this type of writing, the teachers, like I said, get to know their students. The students get to show aspects of who they are. And that makes school a totally different place for a child, that connection.
And don't you think there's a different interaction between the kids then? If they've heard each other's life on paper.
Absolutely.
And they suddenly realize that this girl has only been here for a year and she came here and it was so alien to her own life.
Absolutely. I mean, there's one poem, and I don't have it here, but it's in one of the books that we published from a girl in Central Falls, and she just wrote this incredible detail about arriving into the United States, going to an aunt's house. She'd never met this aunt. Was picked up, you know, at the airport by an aunt, and going to take a shower in her aunt's home, but not knowing how to use the knobs. And such a small, kind of quotidian, banal detail. But I remember her teacher saying, oh my gosh, like, we were talking afterwards, like, it really puts it in the mind of the teacher and the students around that student, what that student's experience and how much courage and faith it takes to kind of uproot yourself from your home, come to a stranger relative's home, and start at a new school, to the point where you don't even know how a shower works in the United States because it's not like any one that you've ever had. And I think that builds bridges, and it creates a culture within a classroom as well. There's
so much in our society that needs this.
Yeah, I agree.
And will change our understanding of our work together as a community.
I was driving yesterday, and I was listening to something about police officers, and I thought, oh, I haven't taught police officers.
Well, yeah.
It's like, you know, I put
they're
poetry
supposed to
everywhere.
Be strong all the time, and they're not allowed to show their own feelings.
Well,
they're supposed to be.
I mean, you know, and like you say, like every corner of the culture could use this, and it's not that I think that poetry solves everything, you know. I wrote a letter to the governor about kind of the state of education and my thoughts shortly after I was appointed, and I said, you know, I'm not an ethereal poet who believes that poetry is going to fix the gaping hole leaking asbestos dust in the classroom. Like, poetry has its limits, and so does art, but there are very real needs that it does address, and opportunities and doors that it does open when people are given the chance for self-expression. And, you know, my first act as Poet Laureate was to establish a small scholarship for a veteran to take for free a poetry workshop with an organization called Frequency Providence that I work with. Because last spring I taught a veterans workshop. And I believe that, you know, like when I said teaching police officers, it's because, you know, if there's a corner of the culture that hasn't necessarily had this experience, I believe that everybody should have it. Doesn't mean everyone should be a writer or a poet, or poetry is going to solve all the problems. But everyone should have the opportunity and tools for meaningful self-expression.
We all need to learn to listen to poetry as well, it seems to me. From the time of Homer before that, poetry was sort of the seer, the way that people heard truth. And I think the poems you've read are truthful.
Yeah.
They are deep, and they pull us out of ourselves to hear differently. And the kids are able to do this because of you. So I thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Thank you for having
I'm
me.
so glad to tell everybody about it, and I certainly wish you well.
Thank you.
And in the next 5 years, as you are Poet Laureate.
Thank you.
I do want to ask you, when you tell kids where to go to write, some of them have chaotic lives.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that maybe saying on television, go to the library, go to a church, go to the children's center, the boys' school, the boys' center, and find a room and write if you need to. Don't make sure that you have a space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good recommendation. And I always say also, you know, just write a little bit. Don't overwhelm yourself. Just write a little bit every day.
Be patient with yourself. Thank you so much, Tina Kane, for coming, and thank you for Writers in the Schools, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. There's a second part to this show. If you want to learn more about Tina, please look on our Facebook page to find it.